Good morning, everyone. This is actually session 2B, Retirement Strategies, and I'm Mary Stone, and I'm the Retirement Staff Fellow at the SOA, and we have two presenters this morning. First up will be Mark Shemtob, to the far right there. So Mark has 35 years of experience in providing actuarial and consulting services to employer retirement programs. He is an FSA and also a certified financial planner. So in addition to his work with employer retirement programs for the past 10 years, Mark has worked closely with retirees in developing personal retirement plans. He has been an adjunct lecturer in finance department at Rutgers University, authored many professional articles on retirement planning, and volunteered on pension committees of the American Academy of Actuaries, currently serving on the Lifetime Income Joint Risk Committee, the Pension Committee, and the Retirement System Assessment and Policy Committee. Mark holds a master's degree from Columbia University and received his financial planner certification education from Fairleigh Dickinson University. Probably messed that up. Okay. To my immediate right is Jacob Siegel, or Jay Siegel as he goes by, and he is semi-retired. Since his formal retirement, he has authored several books in demography, sociolinguistics, and gerontology, principally the demography and epidemiology of human health and aging. He was formerly professorial lecturer in demography, Georgetown University, and senior demographic statistician, Population Division of the U.S. Census Bureau. He's the author of over 100 papers, presentations at professional meetings, and monographs covering such subjects as the completeness of coverage of the census, estimates of centenarians, congressional district delineation, aging of the American population, and trends in retirement age and linguistic ability with advancing age. And over to my left is Doug Andrews, who will be serving as our discussant this morning. He is an adjunct professor at the Department of Statistics and Actuarial Science. I might think of where my mind is, at the University of Waterloo. After a successful career as an actuary, a chartered financial analyst, and a university professor, Andrews' professional time is devoted now to conducting and communicating research as adjunct professor in the Department of Statistics and Actuarial Science at the University of Waterloo. He is managing an international research project that will provide insights useful to policymakers and professionals concerned about the impact that population aging may have on asset values. His research has an international perspective and is designed to produce practical policy recommendations. It is focused on aging, economics, investments, and risk management, and their implications for the management of social support systems such as pensions, healthcare, and long-term care. Andrews received a BA and an MBA from the University of Toronto and an MA and a PhD from the University of Waterloo. And one last housekeeping item before I turn it over to Mark. For anyone in the room who is looking for EA credit, there's forms at the back of the room. If you can just pick one up and fill it out at the end of the session, you could just bring it up to me and I'll make sure that it gets reflected in the records. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, Mary. Jacob just told me I'm the main speaker, which was new news to me. I had no idea that's what it was. So I'm going to take more time maybe than... Oh, no. No? I can't take more time. Then I don't know what the value is of being the main speaker. Just a little background about myself. I know Mary mentioned it, but I transitioned over the last several years from being a retirement plan consultant to someone who really focuses more on individual retirement planning, both at the individual level, but also on a policy basis, working mostly with the American Academy of Actuaries, in addition to some, private work. So, I'm very interested in, as we are now in a defined contribution world, what do people do when they reach age retirement, whether it's 60, 65, or 70? What decisions do they make? How do they create sustainable retirement income? So the common approaches that are used with investments nowadays generally fall into four different categories. Something that's called the 4% rule, which is very popular. Whatever you have there, you take 4% of it. Whatever you've saved, you take 4% of it, and each year you increase it by inflation. And there's been all kinds of work that's been done by William Bagan, going back, I think, to the 70s or 80s, that show that 95% or more of the time that will last somebody's lifetime. As a matter of fact, there's always a very big balance at death in most of the cases. There's something called the MRD, minimum required distribution, or some people will call it the RMD, required minimum distribution approach, where you take your investment balance and you divide it by the factor under Section 401A9 of the Internal Revenue Code, which roughly reflects somebody's life expectancy. Then there's something called bucketing. Under bucketing, you take money, you put it in three different buckets usually. The first bucket is enough to last you 5 years, the next bucket 10 years, the last bucket when anything beyond 15 years. The first bucket will be much more conservatively invested. The next bucket will be a little bit more aggressively, and the last one will be very aggressively invested. And then the last one is laddering. Laddering, basically, you take your investments, you put it into different fixed incomes, or whether they're bonds, whether they're term certain annuities, and you have them spaced out so that they come to maturity each year in an amount that you think you need to spend. There are problems, shortcomings with these different approaches. First and foremost is there's really no modeling of the impact of including lifetime income products like annuities, whether they're immediate annuities, deferred annuities, fixed income annuities. There's no consideration with these four drawdown methods of how Social Security or a company pension fits into the picture. They don't really look at the possibility of the range of possible different lifespans. Most importantly, they're not designed to model or analyze a predetermined spending goal subject to increases and decreases. I mean, I sit down with retirees, and they'll tell me for the first 3 years of their retirement, they want $10,000 a month of income because they're going to travel. They're going to do stuff that maybe they're not going to do later in life. And then they'll tell me after that, maybe they only need $6,000 a month of income. You know, in retirement spending is generally not constant. At different stages of retirement, there are different expense needs. And there are none of those approaches really explicitly measure what we'll call liquidity or legacy levels. And that is basically how much money is still remaining at that point if you need to invade it or upon death. We're going to talk about something called a retirement spending strategy. And what a retirement spending strategy is, it's a total monthly income goal generated from all sources. And as I noted, it can be constant or changing. The strategy should include the selection of a Social Security benefit commencement age. If most of you in the United States, you know that there's a big difference if you collect your money at 62 as compared to age 70. Very significant difference. A spending strategy might also include an insured guaranteed income product. Okay. It also is based upon an asset allocation, holdings in equity, fixed income, or other classes. And it can also include other components where applicable if we could come up with reasonable assumptions. Tax implications, whether to use home equity, long-term care needs, and insurance. So a strategy is basically the pieces that put together your income goal. Now, why use an actuarial approach? Well, we can use an actuarial approach to analyze a strategy using stochastic methods. We can illustrate probabilistic range of outcomes. We could run it with all types of different assumptions. We can use it as a way to compare different strategies, which is what we're going to be doing later in the talk. And it overcomes a lot of the shortfalls that I talked about with the current spending approaches. And it can provide some help in doing an analytical determination of what optimal decisions a retiree might make. So what do we do in analyzing a strategy? Well, probably the single most important thing in a strategy is what is the likelihood that it's going to be successful. And for most people, successful is that their income goal is going to last under non-predictable circumstances. And the two main non-predictable circumstances is what is going to happen in the markets and how long is he or she going to live. The next question is, if that income goal is not to be achieved, and in a lot of cases it won't be achieved if somebody lives a long, long time, what percentage of the goal can be expected? So maybe you're not going to get all your money that you hope for through age 90. You will get it, but then what happens after age 90? Am I going to get 98%? Am I going to get 90%? Am I going to get 60%? The other thing we look at when analyzing a strategy is how much investment balance, how much of my retirement savings is still there, which I will use for either liquidity or legacy. Now, strategies providing a high likelihood of achieving an income goal may result, and may is in italics for a reason, in low liquidity or legacy potential. The reason being some of the strategies that focus on guaranteeing income, either by deferring Social Security or purchasing fixed income annuities, will drain somebody's investment account. And we'll see that in some of the graphs. But may is there for a reason, and we'll see why that's the case. And for some retirees, there is a desire that both income likelihood and legacy levels be considered. So what is the actuarial model that I'm using? Okay. Well, I'm going to run through this, but you have all of this in your packet if you ever want to refer back to it. Okay? But it's a whole bunch of steps, but it's the model that I've created. It is not a unique model. Other models can be created. But here are the steps. We first determine an expected age at death, which we do randomly based on life expectancies. Then at each of those ages, we look at our gross income goal. For each year up to that, we generate rates of return based on the assumptions that we select and the asset classes being used. Then for each of those years, we actually calculate the investment earnings. Then for each of those years, we projected income from every source is calculated. Then we basically take a look and say, our income goal is so many dollars. We have money that is coming from guaranteed sources, whether it's Social Security, a pension, other income. Whatever else we need to meet our income goal, we're going to take out of our investable money. If we have enough money, great. If we don't have enough money, then we're going to start running short. So at the beginning, we're almost always going to have enough money, but in later years, if somebody lives long enough, there's a good chance it's going to drop below what our goal is. We then calculate at each age an estimated balance, how much investment balance is still there over the total investment balance. We do the same thing for how much income we expect over the income goal. We do 10,000 times, and then we do averaging. So there's a mouthful there. It would take me 10 minutes to go through it very slowly. But if this interests you at all, the slides are in your whatever, and you can take a look and walk through it. I'm always happy to discuss it. We need assumptions to do our work. Rates of return, volatility, correlation between investment classes, inflation expectations, probabilities of death by age that will further adjust for retirees' health, other assumptions depending on how sophisticated the model is, which could include future tax rates, long-term care needs, or reverse mortgage rates. We now have developed at each age a metric, at each age a probability of what percentage of the income we expect to receive, and also an investment balance. But it spreads over a period of one's future lifetime. What I try to do is to kind of create some sort of a composite. So what I do is I will take each of the individual ages and do some sort of weighting. And I'll weight them based upon survival to age or probability of death, and then come up with a scoring mechanism. Now, the scoring doesn't do any good unless you really want to compare between different strategies. But the idea here is to try to assign two numbers for each strategy. One that talks about income, one that talks about legacy, and also the remaining investment balance. The output is a graph that we will see that shows at each age expectations, and then we give that score that I talked about for each of the metrics. And then I'm also going to show you bar charts that illustrate expected income from each source. So here's our example. I have a female. Her income goal starts at $6,000 a month, and it increases by 2% a year. She's very healthy. Her date of birth is May 1, 1957. At the time I did this, she was 62. Her Social Security benefit at her Social Security retirement age, which is 66 and a half, is $2,500 a month. She has $1 million set aside for retirement, net of her emergency fund. She's ready to retire. She has no mortgage on her home. She's going to use her home equity as a reverse mortgage for long-term care if needed. And her employer is giving her $5,000 a month for 3 years to get her to encourage her to retire. The assumptions, these were also selected back in May. Fixed income, 2.95% with a variance of 4.4. Equity, 6.95, 15.6. No correlation. Inflation, 2.6. Mortality table, I used the RP table projected to 19, and I use a setback for very healthy individuals. And in median annuity purchase rates were $58.80 per $1,000 of premium for a 62-year-old. And this was back in last May. These may no longer be accurate. Okay. We're going to look at three different strategies. The first one is she starts Social Security immediately. She invests her money 60% equity, 40% bond. She does not purchase a fixed income annuity. The next one, she waits till 66 to start Social Security. She uses 70% equity, 30% bond, spends $250,000 on an annuity. And the last one, age 70, she does an 80-20 split and uses $500,000 for a fixed income annuity. Okay, strategy A. As you can see, let's first look at the income, which is in green, should be in green. So the income she's likely to meet her income goal up until around age 77, 78. There and after, it kind of tails down. And by the time she reaches to 100, she can only expect to get 60% of her goal. Her retirement savings start off low, but then they increase, and they peak at around 83, and then they also start to drop. So that by the time she's age 100, if she gets there, it's going to be a much lower percentage of what she's going to get than what she started with. There's no annuity purchase here. So that I give this a score of 6 out of 10 for income and 9 out of 10 for investment balance. Now, the probability is that she's probably, if you look at the bottom, we have probability of survival. So she's likely to make it to about 91 or 92. Remember, she's very healthy. So she is going to end up with more than likely what she started with, retirement savings. However, she is going to start running out of money along the way. She's going to run short. Here's the next one. Here, where we're talking about age 66, Social Security retirement age, here she buys a fixed income annuity. Of course, what happens is her retirement savings plummet immediately because of the purchase of the annuity. She's also deferring Social Security to age 66. Here, she actually, her legacy and liquidity go down initially, but eventually go way, way up. So sometimes people say, oh, I don't want to buy an annuity because it really hurts my kids. Well, if you live long enough, it doesn't hurt your kids. It helps your kids because it increases the amount of the legacy amount. Income is a lot steadier. Eventually, it does decline, but does not decline significantly compared to the first one. And here's the third one, strategy C, where we're actually waiting till age 70 to start Social Security. We're buying a very large fixed income annuity. Here, you pretty much have your monthly income goal guaranteed for the most part. And as you can see, retirement savings eventually go way, way, way up once everything kicks in. So, observation, strategy A provides for solid investment balance, but with a trade-off for long-term low-income security. Strategy B is really very well balanced, and strategy C is great with income score, but I rate the legacy liquidity score because, as I noted, in the earlier years, if one were to die, it's not there. General observations, 100% income score is near certainty that it'll be achieved. 100% or greater investment balance shows on average that the investment balance will be at least equal to the initial amount. We could also calculate the investment balance on an inflation-adjusted basis. For those not concerned about liquidity or legacy, the balance percentage is likely not important. And this is a key thing, due to averaging, especially for the investment piece, results could indicate that you have money, but you're not getting 100% of your income. The reason being it's skewed for bigger years. Now we look at an analysis of where money's coming from. So strategy A. The blue is the other income. In her case, it's the $3,000, the $6,000 a month, or $5,000 a month. The Social Security is the orange. Yellow is investment payout. Gray is annuity payout, which there's none here. And then the green is the projected shortfall. Here's B. See a lot less of a projected shortfall. C is also small. Okay, I know I've gone way over. Okay, parting thoughts. This kind of quantitative analysis is of value when used in conjunction with qualitative considerations. I don't think this should really drive the ultimate decisions here. Using modeling has to be carefully based on assumptions that are unbiased. This paper is a very simple analysis. We just look at 3 strategies with 3 decision points. You can let your imagination go, and you could analyze and test almost anything. Joint life analysis, taxation, using home equity, different asset classes, different types of annuities. We could use this to look for strategies that maximize the likelihood of achieving specific income goals or maintaining an investment balance. It could also be modified to analyze the tail risk of a strategy. It's only representative. And final point, an actuarial approach is complex. This is not for everybody, especially if somebody doesn't really have much resources. So just thinking about how, as we move forward more into the defined contribution world, it's important to have quantitative tools that will comprehensively look at all retirement sources and look at a lot of different options, as opposed to just one of the basic withdrawal rules. Okay?
Thank you, Mark. See if I can get your. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Gosh. Jay.
Good morning. I'm going to give you an outline of this talk at this point, and we'll go through the slides, and then we'll cycle back if there's still time, and I'll elaborate a few of those items. So the title of the talk, A Review of the Demography of Retirement in the United States. I cover only a few aspects that are of interest to me at the moment, and I hope they're of interest to you. I'm going to read back first the abstract of the paper, the initial paragraph, just to start off. I wrote, the demography of retirement is important because of the role of retirement in the dynamics of the labor force, the role of the socioeconomic status, in our society, and in the sizable impact of Social Security expenditures, particularly on local, state, and federal budgets. The paper is intended, and there is a full paper here rather than simply what you're going to see with a lot of tables, is intended to review some of the leading aspects of the demography of retirement not presented together in an earlier publication, as well as to bring these materials up to date. I have linked labor force changes, age at retirement, age at entering the labor force, years in retirement, and fiscal years of non-work lifetime, giving up-to-date estimates of these elements of retirement in particular. I have spelled out the methodology for developing estimates of the median age of retirement by the method of demographic analysis, and identified some important next areas of research. For example, and this will become clear later, developing estimates of average age of entry into the labor force by demographic analysis, improving the method of estimating retirement age by allowing for the different levels of mortality of disabled and non-disabled retirees, estimating the relative contribution of mortality and fertility and immigration to changes in the retired population, and applying demographic estimates given to derived dollars received by Social Security beneficiaries. So let's roll the tapes, as they say, and there are many retirement concepts, but two operational definitions of retirement have evolved. One is the complete separation from the labor force in later life, and the second, receipt of a pension after a career in the labor force. I see the number 2 got omitted there by mistake. Okay, count that as number 2. In that In that dichotomy, of course, there are many variations of the concept of retirement that are not covered in those two operational definitions. Those part-time workers and different combinations, and things, other factors. Next, I'll talk about the general factors in the structure and aging of the population. You have to understand that historically it was assumed, well, what explains the high percentage of elderly and its increase? And the obvious thing comes to mind, well, people are living longer. But that's not the primary factor. In general, the primary factor in the structure of the age distribution is the historical decline in the birth rate. Now remember, I'm talking about the United States primarily, which is the main focus of this paper. But it turned out, and this was carefully measured, in the late part of the 20th century, there was a sharp turning point in the mortality trend of the United States. Think of the year 1968, the year when some major cardiovascular diseases sharply went down. Nothing like that had happened. Before, all the emphasis was on the reduction in childhood and infant mortality that made that was accounting for mortality changes and the increase in life expectancy. And suddenly we have this change in older and lengthening of life through the reduction of the cardiovascular diseases. At that point, and we don't know when technically that it ended, but what I mean is we don't know when that factor petered out with being the primary factor in explaining the aging of the population. But it might be a couple of decades, from 70 to 90, by looking at the trend in the major endogenous diseases, which when that trend sort of slowed down sharply. I should note here in the item 3 that net immigration is of little significance in the age structure. And that's important to remember because so much is said about immigration is important in changing the structure to increase the support ratio of the elderly people. But in plain English, it ain't going to do much unless you vastly increase immigration beyond anything we've contemplated. And next, I want to talk to you about the trend in the economic dependency and the support ratio. Excuse me. There are several ways to compute economic dependency, but of course the simplest way is to simply use the age distribution. And you might say, well, that's not so good. That doesn't tell you much about the dependency ratio. We want to know about workers. All right, then we'll take number 2, which is to take the ratio of the workers and the elderly non-workers. And so we get an economic dependency ratio. Now the reciprocal of that is the support ratio. How many workers do you have for every non-worker elderly person? And We illustrate a few there on the screen. You see, in 1950, there were 7.4 workers per elderly non-worker, and this sharply began to fall. By 2000, only 4. By 2017, 3.3. By 2030, projected on the basis of population projected, not on the basis of this series, but derived directly from population projections, we have a 2.6 in 2030, and the further unwritten number there, if we go to 2050, it's only 2. Just imagine, only 2 workers per every non-worker elderly. But then as an afterthought, I put down 0.3 to say that as between measuring the economic dependency between just the population structure and the workers, number 2, the number 1 tells you the same trend as 2, saying that population is the primary determinant of dependency or support in this situation, rather than the labor force. And we want you to say, now, of course, we have another way of measuring this through Social Security data by relating contributors to beneficiaries. And that, too, gives you essentially the same trend of sharply declining support for the elderly. All right, next I want to turn to measuring the age at average age of retirement. In this, you may see it is written AAR, average age of retirement. And what I want to emphasize here is that the average age of retirement is a cohort concept, meaning measured by birth cohorts and not by age groups. You know, like the difference between a QX and an MX in a life table, or capital LX and a little lx in an ordinary life table. So what you're looking at in that equation, okay, I'll start back here. What you're looking at in that equation, W, withdrawals from the labor force, or retirement, whatever you want to call it. L2, labor force at the second date. Consider 5 years apart and a 5-year age group. Minus the labor force at the initial date, multiplied by the 5-year survival rate, all adjusted by the square root of the 5-year survival rate, which I'll explain if anyone is interested why we do it that way with the square root of S. But in any case, that's the way I formulated the calculation of the average age of retirement. Now, to go on, we solved this equation for W for each 5-year birth cohort, 50 years old and over. And so you have these numbers for these 5-year age cohorts. And now, what we want to present is the number for an age group. So how do we extract that kind of artificial number? We do it by applying an oscillatory interpolation device. Now, that gives us the two pieces that we need for a given age group. Now, you imagine what we're talking about. Say you're going from age 50, 54 to 55, 59. But then the next age goes 55, 59 to 60 to 64. See how they overlap? If I can do it for you that way, here's the second half and the first half, all referring to the one age group. So we need to apply the Karab-King formula twice over, and it's a 3-point formula, and we add those two pieces. And so we have the elements for computing the median age, which we then do. We could compute the mean, but I preferred the median in my thinking. Now, the comparable sort of number from the Social Security data would simply be the ratio of the beneficiaries' age distribution. I'm sorry, not the ratio, the age distribution of the beneficiaries. But you have to make adjustments for various issues like disability, of people retiring below 62. So now we want to convert that average age to the years in retirement. And you see some numbers here on the screen. To get those numbers, we simply compute the life expectancy at the average age at retirement. So that if you're retiring at some particular age, back in 19, it would be something like retiring at 62. 66, 66 or 67. You would get 12 years of retirement for men and 13.6 years for females. And so moving ahead, you see how the number has jumped ahead so that in the current recent last 5-year period, average years in retirement are up to 18 and a half years and 22 and a half years for women. So average years in retirement are spiraling up also, along with the other measures that we mentioned. To get lifetime years of non-work, we can do that either for the entire lifetime or just for the working ages, say 16 and over. So putting it down for the total lifetime, I take life expectancy at birth and subtract from that the difference between average age at entering the workforce and the average age at retirement. So in simple words, total lifetime minus the years of work. And I get the total years of non-work. And roughly computed, because I did not figure the average age of entering the labor force properly, I mean by this careful cohort design that I referred to for computing average age of exiting the labor force, the same formula could be used. And I come out with, have moved since 1950 from 1/3 of life to just below half of life since 1/3 of life in 17, some current year, to just below half of the life in 1950. So again, many more years of non-retirement. And I've already said that the way you compute properly the average age of entering the labor force is by the same formula I gave you earlier, but just reinterpreted and applied to ages, say 16 or 18 and on to age 50 to get those cohorts for measuring entry into the labor force. So next, I just want to make a comment about the factors affecting the decision to retire or continue working or to re-enter the labor force. Now, to my knowledge, no one has done a careful analysis of partitioning these possible causes for delaying the entry into the labor force or for these changes in average age. Although we have a lot of factors that we can mention for these decisions. But I summarize this in one sentence, and I read to you the workers' willingness to, this is the factors, workers' in willingness to trade income for leisure and the ability of economic supports to achieve the goal. Plain English, you want to have fun, preferred to work, but you need a little money to do it. And if you think, you guess, you got the money, so you quit your job. Now, people in different educational levels make different decisions about whether they would make the choice, how they would apply this generalization. But what we've learned, or what I've come to believe, that the most primary elements of all the factors that we could mention in deciding to retire is that early benefits age from Social Security at 62. And then the other fact, the full retirement at 65 or 66, going on to 70 in the next several years. So beyond that, there are many factors that affect the decision to retire, and I just say they are different logical levels and with different weights. But I give you a selection of them. Just can't get those on the same page here. But a lot of thought has been given to this subject by the people at the Boston Center for Retirement Research. And they include some factors and take a position on them, some of which make sense to me, others I don't agree, but I'll list some things to remind you. Better health, and I put that in quotes because by many indications it ain't so true, okay? But what is true, apparently, from the research is that there is better health for the educated people, but not so much improvement in the less educated. Next, there have been changes in the benefit structure in Social Security, and that's like the rise in the full retirement age to 70, liberalization of the penalty for working and getting a pension, changes in the private benefit structure from defined benefits to plans to contribution benefits, change to less physically demanding jobs, increase in longevity, which I think has little weight. Just think, through all the second half of the 20th century, average age of the retirement for men went down, 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 but health was up, up, up. I mean, longevity was going up. So I don't see much of a relation between people's longevity or their sense of it and their decision to retire. Of course, if they know they're disabled, that's a different question. Then, of course, this background affecting decision to retire, availability of Medicare and Social Security benefits, and then there are recent changes with the health insurance program, expansion and then contraction of national health insurance program. I'm referring to these changes of the Health Affordability Act, where first it was fairly generous in inviting people into the system, and then a contraction then as to its availability and who would secure benefits. And then there's the increasing costs of insurance and the high costs of Medicare medications, which are leading people to drop out of health insurance, which of course is a tremendous benefit in old age for making a possible decision to retire. And now, let's see, there's a problem here. What I do? Leaned on it, huh?
Yeah.
Let's get into that concluding notes. There we go. Now, I'm going to end with some random thoughts on this subject that are seemingly not covered in anything I've said before directly, but I just thought of them as I finished this. The new cohorts that are about to enter Social Security ages will be less healthy than their predecessors, and yet cannot collect full benefits until later ages. I'm just talking about a dilemma here, am I not? As what we're talking about, to clarify that the people below retirement age right now are clearly demonstrated to be less healthy than their predecessors. And you've read about increased use of self-destructive medications and opiates and suicide and in addition, things I'm going to refer to Wednesday in my talk about the many factors that are entering into the picture of health that bodes very badly for the health of the American population. Next, I want to talk about the fact that the population is heavily saddled with debt, whether it be debt that was incurred, say, as a result of the recent recession, or student debt, and that debt will also have to be managed into old age, and they're going to have to depend more on Social Security, even while owing money to pay the debts. Next, on another matter, I don't see any strong signs that the average age of retirement will rise in the future. I didn't make it clear, I think, before about the trend in the average age, so let me digress to cover that now. In 1950, and maybe I'll just refer to, well, males and females, average age was up in the vicinity of retirement at 67. In a few decades, it was down near 63 and 62. So that between 1950-55 and 1995-2000, it had fallen 5 years. Now, it's true that most of that change occurred in the first few decades, 50 to 75, say. And since then, it's fallen a little gradually, and it's turned up in the late 90s, and then it made a fairly substantial increase in the last few years. But accepting what the Boston Center argues, Professor Monell, those factors that account for the increase in average age of retirement in recent years, she thinks is petering out. They've just been short-lived. So that, building on this, I've concluded that there's no strong signs that average age retiring. Now, what's the big importance of that? That still more than half of the people who retire below the full retirement age of 65 or 66. They're retiring now at 64. Men, 64, women, say, similar, just a little different. And I should also have said something that was, I guess, omitted here. The age of retirement of blacks has paralleled that for whites, but a little lower. And we know that people of higher education retire a few years later than non-educated or less educated people. So we have some guidelines as to what is happening. But as to what will happen, it's really a open guess. But I don't think it's going to rise much higher. So in item 4 here, you'll see I wrote many questions remain. Should we eliminate the early retirement age? Should we link retirement age to life expectancy? Should we use immigration to increase the support ratio since fertility and mortality are less subject to control? Well, there are questions then you can reflect on. And I leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay. We'll get it.
Can you get mine out?
Let's see.
Should be probably.
I don't know if it's already loaded, so I'm going to go to here.
To be, what did he
I
do
think
with
here,
it?
let's see.
It was, he just loaded it, isn't it? Is there nothing down there?
I thought all that's down here is marked, so I think we're going to find it on the desktop.
Okay,
I think this might be yours.
Yep. There we go.
Okay, and then
No, that's not.
That's not this one, sorry.
Yep. What was,
That's not it either. Okay, sorry.
all right,
Let's try this again. No. Sorry. Oh, maybe it is here. Hold on.
no.
Oh, no, sorry.
Okay, can we open this up? Andrews 4B. There we go. And what do I put this on slideshow?
Here, let's see. There's a couple different places, but I'm going to, oops, there we go.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for attending this session. I was pleased that the SOA asked me to review these papers. It gave me a chance to look at them in advance. I only have limited time to talk to them, and there are many interesting points, and so I'll only touch on a very few of them. And these certainly are my comments, not anybody else's. With respect to the first paper by Mark, An Actuarial Approach to Retirement Strategy Metrics, it's a very well-written paper. It examines a very important question because there are many people who are retiring and are having to make a decision about how they will be able to manage their income and legacy goals for the balance of their life. It provides a good overview of methods commonly used and their weaknesses, as he explained, and it presents a reasoned approach to try to weigh competing objectives of income and legacy, and he illustrates the approach very clearly with the example that he used. I think there very much is a need for an actuarial approach, so I am happy that Mark has written this paper, because this is a problem that will be faced by most retirees, and there are a wide range of practitioners in this area. Some are actuaries, some are financial planners, some are insurance agents, some are investment counselors, and they all bring different motivations and different qualifications to the subject. And this is an area, I think, where actuaries could contribute, and it is a worldwide issue. So I think there is something not just for the Society of Actuaries, but potentially for the International Actuarial Association to have an actuarial approach. And so I was thinking about what would be essential components of an actuarial approach, and I would suggest that it use a stochastic method. But a major concern with most of the methods used are that they pick an expected age at death, and Mark does some analysis to do that, but he still picks an expected age at death. And I understand in talking to people that it makes everything much easier to calculate and much easier to communicate, but I'm concerned about the misconceptions that may be transmitted with that, and that people may well not meet their objectives, and if it's an actuarial approach, feel that actuaries have let them down. So this is something that I think actuaries need to look at. Also, I don't like the idea of trying to combine an income and a legacy measure in a single measure. I think that for most individuals, it's income objectives that dominate. So that would be what I would emphasize. And finally, I think it has to include tax considerations when you're looking at an income measure, because tax very much affects the amount of income that you are able to retain. And I appreciate that tax is going to be different by jurisdiction, so the model has to be general enough that you could insert your own tax rules into the model. So specifically for this paper, I would have preferred that it not use an expected age at death. I find it confusing and lacking transparency to do the calculations and then convert them to some scale between 0 and 10, because I don't know what that 0 and 10 is and how you get there. It's important to conclude tax. I thought the most useful graphs were the ones slides 23 to 25, where you see those little green parts at the end, which are the shortfalls, and you can see, well, what age does the shortfall start at, and how big is it? And so I think that would be a very useful tool in communicating things. And finally, with respect to Mark's paper, I would like to see some more realistic examples that apply to the range of the population. I mean, all of us looking at that person, a single life, $1 million in savings, a house that's fully paid for, $2,500 in Social Security, only needing $6,000 initially, that person's going to be pretty well off. And perhaps that represents the vast majority of clients of financial planners, but I'm really concerned about the vast majority of people, and I think most people going into retirement are very much on the edge of being able to meet their objectives, if at all, and need to look at some more dicey examples. With respect to Jacob's paper, I do have a caveat. I only received a preliminary version of this paper to review, so I wasn't sure what he was going to be talking about today, so my comments don't necessarily relate directly to his talk, but do relate to his paper, and he did summarize his objectives well. One of the distinctions that he makes, which I think is very useful, was among the definitely retired, the partially retired, and the definitely not retired. He divided up his matrix, and he points out that we don't have data to fill this. I think that's a really important thing that we need to find, our data to fill these components, because until we do, those dependency ratios that he subsequently calculated are not necessarily useful ratios, because there may be partially retired people that should be in the denominator rather than the numerator, and vice versa. But the fourth category that's not shown here are what he categorizes as status indeterminate, and he says these are mostly women who have not been in the labor force for many years or ever. From a society's point of view, it's very important that we look at this group and understand what their income requirements are and what their needs will be. So we shouldn't just throw them out because their status is indeterminate. We need to pay attention to this group. He didn't talk today about labor force participation rate much, but in the paper he does. And I did look up some other research to see what might happen to labor force participation rate, and the suggestion by Kimberly Abadeo is that it's not likely to return to previous highs, some of the reasons being the aging population. There's structural long-term unemployment, which will affect participation rate. There's been a significant decline in middle-skilled jobs, especially affecting those between 25 and 54, middle-skilled jobs being ones that are being replaced by technology and robotics. Increased opioid dependency is affecting the labor force participation rate. Jacob has mentioned it. It's something that we really need to be talking about. And also chronic disabilities, certainly affecting older people, so less likely to be able to continue in the workforce. With respect to the decisions to retire, Jacob quoted a traditional economic argument regarding the trade-off between income and leisure. I think that's way too simple. After the financial crisis, many people lost their jobs, and Social Security was a necessary source of income, and for some, it was the only source of income. So there was large numbers of people that were retiring at age 62. And also, he's quoted some of Alicia Manel's points. I, along with Jacob, question whether better health really is the case, because there has been increased substance abuse. Obesity is still rising, and there are more chronic conditions. And also, Alicia Manel mentions that defined contribution provides increased incentives to work. I think incentives is probably a euphemism. It really creates greater uncertainty regarding retirement. And that may be the tie between these two papers, because Mark has a tool that could be used to help you with this analysis. Thank you.
Okay, because we're nearly at our time, but
Very quickly, I just want to basically just agree. I think it's important for me to agree with the analysis, but one correction. I don't have a static mortality age. I run it 10,000 times, and I get 10.
ages like that.
Yeah, yeah. So you're absolutely correct. I mean, and that would have been a real. So obviously, my paper was not clearly written. So I will take a look at that, and there is no doubt about it that what I did is very simple, and we need a much, much, much more robust program to really analyze all the different things. So I agree with that.
Okay, we'll take the one question, sorry, since we're
Thanks,
out of
Mary.
time.
Rob Brown. Both Jay and Doug mentioned this, why do we retire? What are the reasons for retirement? There was a paper presented, I think, at these sessions about 12, 14 years ago. Author was Brothers, don't remember her first name, but you can go back and find it. And she didn't sit down and do any statistical analysis or try to reach logical conclusions. She did a survey. She went out and talked electronically or otherwise with people, why did you retire? Number one reason, indications from their friends, relatives, and neighbors. Nothing actuarial about it at all.
Well, just out of respect to those who want to move on to the end of the session, I ask if someone has further questions, maybe you can just come up and speak individually to the presenters. Lunch is in the Andiamo restaurant, so hopefully that's back by the lobby. And for anyone who wanted the EA credit, please pick up a form at the back and bring it up to me at the front. I want to thank all of the presenters and Doug as the moderator, and appreciate your attention.
Announced that I have 10 copies of the tables, if anybody, my tables.
Okay. For those who were following along when Jay was speaking, he had different points where he said table 2, table 4. He has 10 copies of his tables here. If anyone wants to get a copy of them, please come up to the podium. Thank you. Appreciate it.